Hey, this video will actually be a compilation of a 6-part series. I made a song from start to finish. It's a boom bap hip hop song with a sample based beat, and a Norwegian rapper named Big Wolf takes the mic and rips it apart. And then I mix it, I master it, and I finally give you some tips on what to do before uploading your song to streaming services. So here are the 6 steps that I'm going to go through when I make a beat. Let's go with the beat making. So what I usually do, I use the MPC and I will record what I need into the MPC as clips. I will record them as clips into the MPC. But here is Ableton Live. It's a slightly different workflow, but I use the same workflow nonetheless, and with some small tweaks because it's another environment. So here I have Ableton Live. I load up an instance of Simpler. In fact, I load up several blank instances of Simpler because this is my go-to sampler in Ableton. And what I've done before is that these songs on the playlists have been converted to MP3 for convenience. I just use whatever app. I just Google YouTube to MP3 and I'll get a lot of shady ads, but I can live with that. So then I have my folder with MP3s, and then I will load them into Simpler one by one. So one song per Simpler instance. And then I chop them up. So I go into the slice section and I'll select how it's chopped up. I need to do some tweaks. By default, it's set to transient, but I prefer beat. And I try to leave warp mode turned off. And then I search for samples. I might go into the classic mode sometimes. There I can scrub the whole MP3 file back and forth. But in the slice section, I will then start to experiment. I might need to adjust the attack a bit and adjust maybe some of the slices to hit better on the beat. It's sort of limited how precise the auto function is. And then I start playing with my keyboard. I hit K to make the keyboard into a piano, and then I just start jamming. And I'll jam and I'll jam, and this time I didn't really love any of the songs. I didn't really feel the samples this time, but I have decided that I'm going to make a beat from this, so my feelings has to be set aside. That's my view of it. So I set my feelings aside and I'll jam until I get something, and it sounds a little something like this. Okay, so that was a basic loop, a 4-bar loop, and then I know that I need something more because it becomes boring to only have one sample going. It can work fine if the sample is a 10 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10. It can work, such as, DJ Premier has a lot of those beats that are only one sample and a drum loop. Come Clean with Jerry the Damager. It's really minimalistic, but it's a 10 out of 10 when it comes to choice of samples and chops. But in this exact case, I know that I need some more, so I have to search the other songs. I think I've found something right here. I'm just jamming on top of this other sample. So I've decided for this to be the loop, and now I'm jamming to find something that fits, that matches, that can be used as maybe transitional effects, or maybe as a second layer, or maybe as a hook, or who knows. Okay, so it's all about jamming, finding the flow, get a feel of it. Even though my feelings are set aside, it's like a duality here where I'm really not that much into this particular playlist, but I'll do my best even though. And then when I finally feel that it's settled, that I have enough content in the samples, in the loop, like I have this main loop, I have this other alternative loop over here, which might be the hook, and I have some hits or stabs or licks or what you want to call it, then it's time to move over to the drums. So here comes the drum section. And I will do this really simple because you already hear in the main loop there's a drum loop going on. Especially the snare is quite prominent. So what I do is I load up a folder that I have, and I'm sharing it with you as well. So it's a really nice folder of 20 kicks, 20 snares, 20 hi-hats, some basses, and some transitional effects that I have collected over the years, and those are some of my favorite samples to use. You can download it. The link is in the description. It's absolutely free. And I've always find something here. So I have found a kick, and I found a snare, and I feel that these two combined makes a good job. They fit in together and they make sense in the context of the loop. And I just used the Ableton drum rack to get this moving on. And I jam until I found something that makes sense. I have actually two kicks. One kick that's the main kick and one kick that alternates a bit to just give it some movement, some extra vibe, some extra rhythmical structure. And I'm thinking about, should I do something with the groove here, because the groove is really swingy. I don't know if I like it to be that swingy, but if I start doing that, there will be artifacts because the sample is the way it is. I can always time stretch it, but I've tried it and it doesn't work. The sounds are in a frequency where that doesn't make a lot of sense. It becomes really obvious when I time stretch it. I'll leave it alone for now. Maybe I'll do something in Logic later on, because I will eventually export this to Logic to do the arrangement. That will be the next video. You can also hear in the sample there is a nice hi-hat. I don't like to exaggerate hi-hats. I think hi-hats are great for inducing energy and inserting some movement and emotion. And those hi-hats that are in there is more than enough. They're more than sufficient. And if I at a later point want to extract the hi-hats from the mix, I can just use a filter and notch it out, almost completely removing them without removing other parts of the same loop. So yeah, so that was the drums. And if you had any value out of this at this point, hit the like button. I would really appreciate it, because, you know, the algorithms and all that good stuff. And the final thing I'm going to talk about is the bass, because that's the final thing that I insert into the composition. The sub bass is basically a sine wave in most cases and when I produce, but I need some more bass, and I already hear that in the main loop sample there is a bass going on, but I think it's a bit weak and it's a bit anonymous. Just to make sure, I'll make a bass line separate and I will include this into the arrangement, and I have the choice later on to just remove it if I don't need it. Maybe it's sufficient with the bass that's already in the loop, but I don't take any chances. I want to have the best possible framework to go on with. So in this case, when it comes to the bass, I load up a BA1 from Baby Audio. It's an old school toy-ish synthesizer, which really isn't a toy. It's a real professional piece of equipment. However, what I notice is that it has got a lot of nice vibe, but it doesn't have a sine wave to make subs. I will come back to that later. But it was quite easy, I think, to tweak this synthesizer. I start with the default and I just play with the controls, play with the filters, with the attack and release section, the envelopes, messing a bit around with the oscillators and the LFO, and make it sound a bit with a bit of a movement, but not too much, and insert some grit as well. So this is a really nice synthesizer plugin. I think I dialed in a really nice bass, at least a texturized bass. I always think of bass in terms of two things. One is the sub bass, which is underneath 100 hertz. Everything under there I call the sub, and everything above is the texturized bass, which isn't really that earth-shattering bass, but it could be as well. And that bass is more stereo. It can be more stereo if needed, with more saturation, and that's the bass you hear when you play it back on your phone, for example. So I ended up using this BA1 synth, which hasn't got much to do with the bass in the sample chops. It has more to do with the groove and the melody. So it sounds like this. And what I found is that it's not earth-shattering enough, so I went back to the bass folder in my free sample pack that you can download with the link in the description. And I found another bass that suited the bill perfectly. It's a bass sample, but it's based off of a sine wave with a little bit of fatness to it. So this really helped fulfilling the low end together with the kick. Those two played perfectly well together, and as you will see later on at the mixing stage, there's really not much else needed to do with the kick and the bass relationship because they fitted so well together initially. So as you can see, my sequence is samples first, then drums, and then finally bass. And what's your sequence? I want to know. Hit me up in the comments. And let me also know in the comments what was your biggest takeaway from this video with me showing you my workflow. Let me know. Now I have a 4-bar loop, and step 2 in this process will be to arrange this into whole complete beats so that it's easy for a rapper to just jump on it and make some magic. Hey, in this video I take a 4-bar loop and turn it into a full composition, a full beat that I can proudly present to other people. Let's go! So the first thing I do is that I export the tracks from the session that I worked in. So I've made a loop and I want to export those tracks. In this case, it's from Ableton Live, so I'll export them. And then they're placed in a folder. I rename the individual tracks because I didn't do that in Ableton. And then I drag them into Logic Pro, like this. And I use a template that is also available as a free download. You can just check the link in the description. You can download a pack of templates that I have laying there for you to use if you need them. And then once I've dragged them into Logic, I will drag each individual track into the corresponding track already in the template because they are rooted into several buses that I like to use. And here are the buses. It's the drum bus, the bass bus, the instrument bus, and sometimes I have vocal tracks as well. That's seldom when I'm just in the beat making stage, but I have tracks there for vocals as well. And once I've done that, I color them. And I name them correctly. Next thing I do is I duplicate the 4-bar loop so that I have 4 times the amount that I started off with. I do the same thing when it comes to 8-bar or even 16-bar loops. I just like to have 4 versions of the loop. So then I have one version where I'm thinking about an intro. I have one version that I'm thinking about one type of verse, and I have one version that is another type of a verse, and then I have one version for something that has to do with a chorus or a hook, and the outro will come as the last thing I do. The first thing I do is I check that everything is in place, and sometimes I find that I have to redo some elements. I might need to move a kick a little bit and a snare a little bit, and I have to make minor adjustments because in the arrangement stage and in a new DAW and in a new setting and maybe even in a new day, I see things that I didn't see initially when I was in the flow states as I am when I'm making beats. So this is not the writing stage, this is the arrangement stage. My internal critic shows up here and does a good job of taking away things that I thought sounded cool when I started making the beats. And my system is this: import, find the correct place for every tracks, name the tracks, and color the tracks. Okay, so now I have 4 versions of the loop, duplicated 4 times. So I have a beat that is 4 times as long. And now I start with the second thing, which is clean up the tracks and correct any mistake that I have made laying around. And while I do this, I tend to use some EQ, maybe even some compression, just to make the sounds fit better together, because I can't help but do a bit of basic mixing while I'm doing the arrangement, which also in turn, when it comes time for mixing, it will be a bit simpler. Everything is laid down, all the basic stuff such as remove rumble and remove all the frequencies, notching out frequencies I don't need, that will be ready when it's time for mixing. So what I tend to do is that I make sure that the snare is what it should be, the kick is in place, and also the hi-hats, but this does not apply in this case because the hi-hats is a part of the main loop. And then comes the bass, and I found actually when I imported this that the bass didn't fit at all, because when I produce I use one set of headphones, and at the arrangement stage I use another set of headphones plus speakers, so I hear more details then, and when I hear those details I have to do it again. This time around I did it again in Logic. I played back the bass again. I felt that there needed to be another melody. The notes had to come in different places this time around, and that's the whole process from sketching it out to finishing it. It's always going back and forth, tweaking. It's not a set step-by-step program that you can just follow through, and when you're done with step 1 you can move over to step 2. That's not how I work, at least. I go from step 1 and then I go to step 2 and then I go back to step 1 and then I go to step 3 and back to step 2, and then I move like that. But in this case I started off with the drums, thinking about them, then the bass, and then I had to do a lot of re-recording and re-editing, and then the main loops and the hits, and then I started to add some reverb effects, some delay, some effects. I felt that I needed it, and then as you can see I added some automation. I automated the filter on the EQ on the main loop just to let another element through at the end of every 4 bars. I also inserted some movement into this string instrument, this alt loop. I pitched it up a 7th and I blended that in for every second time this loop was played. And this really gave some neat variation and movement to the overall sound. And I think that also applies in the arrangement category. It's like that's not a mixing thing, it's more of a producer thing. And when everything seems to be fine and perfect as it could be at least, I duplicate all these regions until I get the full song. And in this case, I wanted it to be 2 minutes long because it's for the sample challenge 314, the Chris McManus, aka DJ Stress. He has a sample challenge going on every week and everyone can join in, and all the info you need to join in is in the description. And then comes time for variations and transitions, making it coming alive with movement and such. The final thing that I do is that I mute some of the tracks here and there. Not everything should be played all the time, especially in a track like this where it's really the variation that is driving this beat, because the loop is so monotonous and it's not really the greatest loop that you can find. It's not that breakthrough loop that you can make a hit of. Still, you can get a dope beat with a mediocre sample, and that's my opinion at least. So I think the result here, as we are hearing now, is starting to sound quite good. Better than it could be if I had chosen to give up and not make this beat, because I didn't really feel the samples initially. Hit the like button if you liked this video so far, and which of these arrangement tactics did you like the most? Let me know in the comments. So as you can see, when I'm arranging a beat, I also mix it sort of, because those are intertwined processes, so it's difficult not to do some basic mixing when arranging. But now in this next video, which will be step 3 in the process, I mix the beat from A to Z as good as I can, making it sound as good as possible. And I hope that you like it. I'm using only stock Logic plugins, and this is to demonstrate that you can do this using stock Ableton plugins, stock FL Studio plugins, stock Cubase plugins, and so on. So here comes step 3, mixing the beat with stock Logic plugins only. Let's go. In this video, I'm going to use only the stock plugins that comes with Logic Pro X. So the first thing that I do in a mix usually is I make a static mix, as they say. I try as hard as I can to make all elements have their own place and get the volume and attention that they deserve. That's the static mix. And the first thing I reach for is the faders, and here you can look at the faders. So as you can see here, the kicks have been lowered a bit in volume, the snares remained, whilst the sub bass has also been significantly lowered in volume, and the bass texture has been lowered a bit as well. This is a result of tweaks back and forth in the mix. The main loop has been remained untouched, so that has been remained untouched together with the snare. So listen to these two together. They sound beautiful together. Okay. Next up, we have the alternative loops 1 and 2. They have been lowered a bit in volume respectively. Okay. And then we have the alt loop 2, which have been reduced a bit here. Let's see. And then we have the hits, also a bit down in level, but the alt loop and the sub bass are the two that has suffered the most reduction in volume. The hits, let's see where we have them here, for example. And then at the bus stage, we have the drum bus here, we have the bass bus and the instruments bus, and also the effects bus, which I have left untouched. As you can see here, a bit dip in volume on both bass and drums, and that's basically it. And then comes the panning, and I have left the kicks and the snares in the dead center. I have also left the main loop in the dead center, and also the alt loop, which is this right here. I have also left that dead center because both of these are basically stereo signals and they are quite significant in the mix as well. So I have chosen to leave them as stereo as possible, but in the middle, because there's information on both sides, on both those two loops. And the alternative loop here, which is a smaller element in the mix, I have panned that out a bit, even though it's a stereo sample. Let's listen. I have done something nifty here. I will come back to that. There's stuff going on the opposite channel, but I'll revisit that in just a moment. And finally, when it comes to the balance was already set when I made the beat, because I listened to which elements that needed to fit in to make a whole mix from the bottom all the way up to the top, and everything that should be in the mid-range. I had at least a hunch that this would be easy to mix. That was my goal. I developed sort of an intuition of what sounds good in the end. Okay, and also about panning, you have some panning on the verb sections here. We have the instruments verb that has remained untouched, but we have the snare verb, for example, is panned a bit to the side, and one of the instruments delay is panned a bit to the right. And if you like this video so far, hit the like button and let's move forward. Next up is processing. With processing, I mean EQ, compression, saturation, and send effects. When it comes to processing, the first thing you notice is that I haven't done anything with the kicks. Nothing. No EQ, no compression, nothing. But on the drum bus, I have used a bit crusher, and I have inserted quite a generous amount of clipping. To make it tighter and more focused. I've used the gain knob to back down on the volume, so you can listen with and without. Without first. Tighter and more focused. Okay, let's take a look at the snare here. Only thing going on there is a snare verb. You can listen in solo. Okay, so that's the snare. A bit of a reverb. I've used the chroma verb with a decay of 1.6 seconds, bit slower attack, and a pre-delay of 60 milliseconds. The airy setting, this one I found to be best sounding. I've also inserted an EQ to roll off the low end and roll off some high end. I often do that when it comes to reverbs in the mix, to avoid muddiness and to cut away the stuff that is unneeded. Next up, and here's the bass texture. Here we have some processing going on. This is what I had from the BA1 synthesizer. Sounds like this. Oftentimes, my texturized bass is without much low end at all. I used to roll in my low end because I played that along with the sub bass. But in this case, actually, they don't play together. So I kept the low end and I've actually boosted a bit. I've cut the very lows and I've boosted a bit in the 80 hertz section. I've cut away a lot of the top end. I didn't need it in the context. You can listen with it and without. Then it became almost like a lead synth and I didn't want that. I wanted to be pulled back in the mix and yet having that sweet low end with a bit of distortion. Because you see here, I have a distortion plugin going on. I can take it from the top. So I have the EQ going on. And then I have the distortion, giving it more body, more weight. And then I have another EQ, but it doesn't do anything. I found that I didn't need it. And then there's a compressor. It's just to keep the level consistent because I noticed that it had a sort of a volume bump here and there in the transition between notes. So that's it for the processing of the bass with the texture. And then comes the sub bass, which I haven't done anything with. This one just drives the bottom here and there. I don't overuse it. It's not used in an exaggerated way at all. It's just laying there and... Okay, and moving on to the main loop. What's going on here is an EQ. I've cut away some low end and cut away some high end. And then a compressor to tame that snare that's popping off. And then an EQ with slight cutoff. And I think I automate the low cuts in the beginning with the first EQ. And there's a send effect, and it doesn't do anything except one thing, and that's right here. It happens only one time during the beats, and I like those small details that just happens once. I like that. You can hear it in the context of the mix. It just goes away and then it comes back again. And if you want more mixing tips, you can download my free guide. It's called the Subphotic Mixing Guide for Producers. The link is in the description. It's a fast 5-minute read. Next up, the alt loop. I've got some EQ going on here. The EQ is high cuts and a generous low cuts. And here's a pitch shifter going on. Some harmonies are coming out there. It's really sweet. And then we have the alt loop 2, which is this one. I only have an EQ here, doing some boosts in the 4K area and a generous amount of low cut. Just want to comment on that. I have a send effect going into a standard quarter note delay with a decent amount of feedback. And what it does is that this is panned the opposite direction. So when it hits, and then it slides to the other side of the mix. Like so. Like that effect. Then we have the last piece of the puzzle is the hits, as I call them. It goes like this. I have an EQ here, and this is actually an idle EQ. It doesn't do anything, but the compressor does compress quite a bit just to control the dynamics a bit. The bass bus has a bit of compression from the kicks. So it's a bit of a compression. Let's see. Five decibels of gain reduction from the kick, just to make sure that it doesn't clash anything. And then we have the mix bus, where I have a compressor going on, stock Logic compressor emulating the SSL G bus compressor. Some slight movements here with a slow attack and a fast-ish release, and 1.5 ratio, just to give it a bit of a glue. And I have another compressor, and this has a low pass filter, so it doesn't compress what's beneath 60 hertz, which gives another type of compression. These are actually two bus compressors working in tandem. One of them takes everything, and the other takes only what's from 60 hertz and up. And then I have this tube EQ. It's just to insert some vibe. I just run it through it. I don't do much. I boost a bit in the high end on 12 kilohertz. And I also attend at the same amount, and I do the same thing at the low end at 30 hertz. I just give it a bit of a smiley curve, but that's really subtle. On the master bus, I have a bit crusher working slightly. Slightly was an understatement, so it works quite hard, but I use it also to drive up the volume because the mix is quite soft. It hits at -6, -10, somewhere there. So I just used those last plugins to boost the gain. I could have done this in the gain staging stage, but I didn't have the time. I did it really quick. And then comes the limiter that does some gain reduction. Some gain reduction here and there, especially when the snare hits, because the snare is quite hard on this one. And then finally an EQ. The EQ is just taking down a bit of the low end, lifting a bit of the top end with a linear phase EQ in stereo mode. And that's it for the processing. And when this is done, the mix is done, and the volume is also loud enough. And with this last limiter, the beat is basically mastered, because I can now release it on and publish it wherever I want. I can send it to artists, and they can do their stuff on it. And when I get some vocals back, I would turn off that limiter and mix the vocals with the beat, and then have it mastered as a separate stereo file. So as you can see, you don't actually need more than the stock plugins to do a more than decent mix of a beat. You just need to know what you're doing. And for this next step, I've received vocals from my homie Big Wolf, and I'm going to incorporate that into the beats and make a song of it. And if you're specifically interested in vocals, go ahead and download my free vocals checklist. The link is also in the description. It's subphotic.com/vocals. It's a basic checklist containing everything you need to get a good sounding vocal take in your home studio. So everything from choice of equipment to recording to mixing and to adjusting to the beat. So you get the whole thing in just a checklist that is 3 or 4 pages long. So grab it, subphotic.com/vocals, and I can't wait to show you the next segment, which is step 4, mixing the vocals to the beats. Let's go. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the chorus, and that's the most attention-grabbing element of the song, the most important element, I think, and it goes a little something like this. Har ingenting å si om du kan høre meg. Stadig på mitt vipsår. Aldri gjort det for å profitere på det som noe krypsår. Kom og vibb med meg. Kom og vibb med meg. Stadig. Okay, so what we have here is 2 main vocal tracks, hook L and hook R, and those go into the lead vocal bus. These are basically 2 tracks that has been performed more or less the same. So it's not that stereo, but I have panned it nonetheless. 30 on both sides, plus and minus. And I've lowered them a bit in volume, down to -2. That's a matter of tweaking. On those two, I have some processing going on. So let's just mute the backing vocals and let's listen. First thing I have here is a preamp. This is the Universal Audio native one without the need for an interface or any hardware. And I've just boosted all the way to 10 to give it some sweet distortion. The input signal was quite low at -16, so therefore I had to boost it a lot there. I could of course have boosted here beforehand using clip gain volume, but I did it fast, I guess, so this was my solution this time. I have added a bit of low cut, not much, up to 50 Hertz. I have boosted a bit in the low end at 110. I've cut a bit at 3.2 kilohertz, and I've lifted it a bit, just slightly. And I've set the output volume a bit down to compensate for the increase in volume over here. This is just to insert some nice distortion. Next up, I have a Pro Q3. This is just a regular EQ. I prefer the Pro Q3 when I work. I've cut slightly at 500 Hertz, and I've cut even slightlier at 1600 Hertz, and this is dynamic, so there were some resonances here that I didn't like, but I didn't want to notch them out. I just wanted them to be suppressed at certain times. So this is a dynamic EQ. I could have used it statically also, but I didn't take the chance in this case. Next up, standard compressor. This is the Pro C2 from FabFilter, but I could have used the stock compressor as well, but this is just my go-to workhorse compressor. I use this all the time for everything. I prefer the clean setting when I just want some dynamic control. I have a fast attack and a medium release, a decent 5.4 reduction in volume. Next up, another compressor, and this is the LA2A. This is one of my favorite compressor plugins. I don't think I'm the only one. A musical 1 decibel of gain reduction, just to insert a bit of that opto sound, not to compress that much. It wasn't more needed. I had to suppress some harshness in the upper frequencies. The S's were a bit sibilant. We open it a bit up with the Neve, and then we remove some resonances with the Pro Q, and then we compress it with the Pro C, and then we use the LA2A to infuse some sweet opto compression, but just a tiny little bit, and then finally a de-esser at the end, the Soothe 2. And if you think this video has helped you in any way this far, hit the like button. Next up, we have the Send Effects, which consists of a reverb and a delay. This is the Crystalline from Baby Audio. I really like to use this one because it's good looking, and I think I can get some good sounds out of it immediately. I found that I needed a medium size on this thing, some sweet sparkle, and I've used some tone control. I have made it to the best resolution. I wanted it to sound as clean as possible. And what I like about Crystalline is that it automatically syncs to the beat of the song. So here, for example, I have it synced to half note to calculate the milliseconds of the decay. I really like that. So that's the Crystalline. And before the Crystalline, I have a Pro Q3. An EQ where I have cut out decent amount of high and lows because I don't want any highs or lows to muffle up the mix. And I think it's a bit difficult to do that in the Crystalline plugin, so I just did it beforehand, before hitting the reverb. And then comes the delay, an Echo Boy from Soundtoys. This is my go-to delay plugin. I've ping-ponged it, 16th notes. Listen to this. This delay here, which is 16th notes, I've used basically to make it blend better with the beats. It's not to make it wider or fatter, it's to make it blend better. And then comes the backing, the dubs as we can call them. The processing here is much more basic. I've basically done the same on both the right and the left. If I wanted it even more stereo, I could have tweaked the EQ differently on those two, but I didn't feel it was necessary this time. First, I've got an EQ where I've filtered out up to 400 Hertz. I've really removed a lot of low end, and I've done the same thing here at the high end. And then I've compressed it with a fast attack and a medium release, 7.2 decibels of gain reduction at most. Then a reverb. This is the back verb, as I call it. This is a Valhalla Vintage verb at 2.54 seconds of decay, some pre-delay. And on the other side, the one that I've panned all the way to the other side, I got another Valhalla Vintage verb with another color, another setting. This is the 70s setting, which is a bit dirtier sounding, and I have doubled the pre-delay. The decay is a bit faster just to compensate. And I have different settings as well, different modes, plate here and dirty hole there, just to give them some different vibes. This reverb here is panned all the way to the left, and conversely, this one here is panned all the way to the right, along with the reverb, which is also panned all the way to the right, which gives a nice stereo effect. I've used flex pitch here. This is the stock Logic Pro Melodyne plugin, actually, but it's integrated into Logic. I've just tweaked a bit to make it cleaner sounding on one side, and I've left it a bit more dirty on the other side. I haven't treated this with any pitch at all. So the stereo effect is indeed present, I think. And then finally we have a delay, which is the same on both sides. And here I've used the Baby Audio Comeback Kit. Baby Comeback, actually, the Baby Comeback. This is the light version of the Comeback Kit. 1/8 notes, some medium feedback, medium time. 1/8 notes, medium feedback, a bit of a ducker to make it a bit cleaner. And that's it. No fancy stuff going on. It's just to give it a bit more of a stereo vibe. This is, of course, not meant to be played alone. This is just meant as an additional layer to the existing hook to make it more hooky or chorusy. Next up, we have the verse. Now, let me show you. Listen. So, looking at the verse tracks, actually the only difference in the processing is the sound effects, which is a bit more subtle. It's not that loud in volume. As you can see, if we compare with the verse and the hook, the chorus has louder sound effects. So that's the difference. However, one thing that you can see here, there's a lot of cuts here, and that's my track preparations. If you look at the gain settings here, you see that I have a lot of differences in volume. Here's minus 4.7, minus 6.6, minus 9.9, 8.5, 7.5, and so on and so forth. This is the clip gain automation at work to make it more consistent sounding and less dynamic, but without removing all the dynamics, giving the compressor more room to breathe. Anyhow, look at the number of plugins on my vocal track here. Depending on your standards, do you use this many or this few plugins on your vocal tracks? Let me know. Hit me up in the comments. Now, over to the backing vocals. Let's start with the verse. What I got here is just one backing track. I usually get two, but I had one this time to work with. So what I did here, instead of making it sound really stereo, I just made two tracks where I pulled down some snippets here and there just to create some movement and some interests. I've cut them up removed all the silent areas. I could have used a gate, but I chose not to because I think the gate also inserts some artifacts that I'm not so fond of. Some basic processing, cutting out the lows and the highs, compressing it like crazy, and putting on some additional opto compression. And then finally we have the ad-libs. The ad-libs I've treated really simple, just with an EQ and a compressor. These are really far behind in the mix, so they're a bit dark sounding. A good amount of reverb, and the final thing that separates it from the rest, an 8-note delay, like this. It's quite significant sounding as well. And I've sidechained the bass from about 110 hertz. It's because the bass was drowning the vocals a bit, so the bass is being ducked slightly whenever the vocal plays, and that's the lead vocal as is. Oh, just as a reminder, download my free mixing guide. The link is in the description. It's a 5-minute to read PDF, and go get it. Finally, I just want to show you the last step of the chain. This is like the last crucial step, the bonus tip that I promised you at the beginning, and it's the mix bus, the mix bus processing. Many people discuss whether or not you should leave the mix bus alone when mixing and save it for the mastering engineer. I do whatever I feel the song needs, and sometimes I start with the mix bus and then I move backwards like a top-down mixing type thing, but regularly I will start with the tracks and then I will move myself forward. But in this case I have done a lot of stuff with the mix bus, and I can show you right here. I started out with a bit crusher because I wanted to smash. This was for the beat actually, I just wanted to smash it, and I found that it sounded nice together with the vocals as well. And then I've lifted it a bit with an EQ, reduced the bass a bit, slightly. And then with a Pro Q3, I have done some crazy stuff here. It's not actually that crazy. It seems quite far out, but let me just explain what I've done here. I've taken the sides and high-passed it up until 121 hertz. Then I have taken the mids down a bit at 240 hertz because I felt that the bass was more present this way without having the sides suffer. And also the vocals became clearer. 2.5 decibels of reduction here. And then at the top here, I found some resonances that I didn't like at 3300 hertz. And I've lifted the sides ever so slightly. And I've taken a right and left approach here. I've reduced the left side about 0.5 dB and lifted the right side about 1.5 dB. It's just because I felt the balance was a bit off. I could always have gone back to the mix and done something, but I found that I just solved it this way this time. So that's the EQ. A lot of stuff is going on in the EQ, but it's only a couple of dB here and there, and it really made everything sound cleaner and more balanced. Then there's a limiter, which just limits some peaks, nothing crazy. And then a multiband compressor to control the bass a bit, to give it a slight boost in volume on the highs again, but also in a controlled manner. It will always duck wherever it's excessive, like so. It tames the bass a bit, just keeps it on the leash, and also the high end is being kept on a strict leash as well. And then I have a Pro L2, it's a limiter. I've turned that off for the moment because I want to export this and master it. Wow, now we're really closing in on finishing that song. Now what we need is some final polishing, and what I used to do is use a touch of hardware, but you can do it with stock plugins even. My go-to third-party plugins for mastering are the FabFilter bundle, the iZotope bundle, and some occasional Plugin Alliance plugins, and maybe even some Soundtoys. But anyways, you can do all of this with just stock plugins. The principle remains: you need some equalization, you need some compression, maybe some saturation, and most definitely some limiting, and limiting in series series. And now comes step 5, which will be to master the song and making it release ready. Let's go!
Her på min ting og jeg må gjøre det for meg. Har ingenting å si om du kan høre meg. Stadig på mitt vips og aldri gjort det for å profitere på det som noe krips. Så kom og vipp med meg. Kom og vipp med meg. Stadig på min vips og aldri gjort det for å profitere på det som noe krips.
The Logic Pro session that I use here is called the Subphotic Analog Clean. It's downloadable and available in the description. It's free, go get it. So what you see here is the waveform of the final mix. It's without a limiter, so you see that there are some dynamic variations, just as a hint on the visuals on the waveform. You can see that. I like to keep as much dynamic intact as I can without it being too weak sounding and too low in volume. I don't like my mix to be too quiet, but I always strive for that sweet spot. And the first thing that I do is that I calibrate my hardware. So I will start with the SSL Fusion and work my way from there. I need the mix to be somewhere at -18. First, I'll pull up a meter to just check. And if it exceeds this sort of limits, I will reduce it a bit in volume. I will just use clip gain before I send it out of the DAW and into my SSL. Having done that, I'm ready. I can start experimenting a bit. Here's the first tweak. This is the SSL Fusion. Now on my SSL, everything is set to 0 and it's ready to go. I start off with the vintage drive, as you see, and here I start tweaking the drive knob. I'm exaggerating it, and I can hear what it really does with the sound, and then I back it off until I reach more conservative levels. And I will also use the output trim to lower the volume again to get it back down to where it was previously before the processing. And then I continue tweaking the density knob. I found that a little below the middle was the sweet spot for the density. And then came time for the EQ. I thought that the bass was perfect. It didn't need anything else. It didn't need a lift to my ears. The bass didn't need any boost at all, so I just left that be. I focused on the high end. The mix is quite dark, so I think it needs a bit of lift in the top end. The good thing about SSL Fusion is that I'm able to be generous with the high end because I have a high frequency compressor, which is sort of like a de-esser. I can choose where it kicks in. As you can see on the crossover frequency, the EQ is set on 16 kilohertz and the crossover is at 10 kilohertz for the high frequency compressor, which ensures that everything that I've boosted is being clamped down on at the next stage in the processing to tame all those nasty artifacts of the boost. And of course, I play with the threshold. I don't want it to sound unnatural, but I want a bit of that effect as well. So I need that high-end sheen, but I need it to be contained as well. So it's being compressed. And then over to the stereo imager, I experiment a bit with the width and with the space, and I just tweak it to taste. I don't want to exaggerate those processors because in essence, I really don't like stereo imagers as a concept. I like to make my mixes wide in the mix stage, especially when I'm the one doing the mix. I like to do as much as I can during the mix stage and just do small tweaks in the mastering stage. That's the ideal situation, but when I get mixes from other people, it varies. Some mixes are much better than mine and some mixes are worse. So it's good to have the option of really enhancing the stereo width if needed, but it will of course bring on artifacts as well. I used to go easy on the stereo imaging, and then I've activated the transformer in the SSL. This is just a button that I press in. It engages the transformers, which gives more of an analog mojo, as they say. So what I used to do, I close my eyes and I press that button many times. I listen and then I open my eyes and oh, that's the best. And that's it for the SSL Fusion. And if you like this video, hit the like button. Now over to the Warm Audio Bus Comp. I start by engaging the compressor section, which is a switch of a button, and then I exaggerate the threshold so I can hear what I'm doing. Next up, I tweak the attack and release according to taste. Oftentimes, I tend to have a slow attack and a medium to fast release. I tend to find the release at 0.3 is my sweet spot in most cases, but I always experiment. And in this unique case, I actually found that the release was best set at 0.6. And then I used the makeup gain to compensate for the loss in volume. And then I turned the threshold back down again, so I get a more conservative gain reduction. And I apply the high pass filter at 60 Hz just to leave the bass alone a bit and get a compression that is more fair to the upper frequencies. So that's it for the Warm Audio Bus Comp. Now I have two processors working on my sound. I got the SSL Fusion, I got the Warm Audio Bus Comp doing some compression, and now it's time to do the final tweaks. And I pull up a Pro Q3 from FabFilter and I sweep for problem frequencies just to check. And at approximately 300 Hz, 1000 Hz, and 3000 Hz, there are some inconsistencies going on that I have to deal with. I think at least I'll try. And I end up using the Pro Q3 in dynamic mode on all three bands that I've selected. And I found that the song sounded a lot cleaner that way. So no treatment at the lows, no treatment at the highs. I think I'm done with those frequencies. And then I pull up a limiter. I use the Pro L2 from FabFilter. I've been using that for almost 2 years now, and I'm really satisfied with it. I like it very much. It can do a great deal of gain reduction without leaving a lot of artifacts, and I think that's one of the greatest strengths about the Pro L. I like the layout, I like the user interface, and I think it's really easy and fast to use. Now, a quick breakdown of my thinking here. I turn off true peak limiting. The transients are suffering under the attack of true peak limiting, so I'll turn that off. I turn oversampling to 4x to ensure that I get as few artifacts in the higher frequencies as possible when I bounce the song. I play with exaggerated settings to hear what is going on with the song when the compression is being applied, and then I back down when I'm satisfied with the results. I tend to use a medium to a slightly fast attack, and the same with the release. And I experiment some with the style settings, which is what color, what kind of vibe do I want. And when I'm happy, I turn the threshold down to livable levels and gain stage it properly, making sure that I have -1 decibel of headroom and I have -1 decibel of output level. And then I pull up my meterings, which is the tonal balance control and the insight from iZotope. And I use those meters just to check where am I at when it comes to overall LUFS. I usually aim for about -10 to -8, which I have experienced works good for most streaming platforms. And I use the tonal balance control to give me any hints or clues about something that goes on in the mix that I might have overlooked, but I think this looks good. I also check the stereo spectrum to see how wide the mix is represented in that meter. It also gives me some clue, but ultimately it's the ears that I have to use. Okay, so here we are. We have finished the song, it's mastered, it's ready to ship. Now comes a video that it's actually a checklist of everything that you need to consider before you release your song, upload it to streaming services and so on. And I hope you enjoy it. And the first item on this checklist would be the headroom. Make sure that before you release your song, you have at least a decibel or so of headroom before the peaks hit the ceiling, and that's -1 at the peak meter, as you can see here. Some operate with -0.5, some like -0.3, but the most important thing is that your signal don't peak. It can make nasty distortions and artifacts that you don't want in your song. And if by the off chance you find that your song peaks at some point, you can fix it. You can fix it either by automating and turning down that specific part of the song that is peaking, or you can go back to the mix and fix it there. But I think in this case, the most easiest thing is to just fix it with automation on the stereo file. Second item on the list, loudness. Check that you have sufficient loudness on your track, but at the same time you want to retain some dynamics. So there's a sweet spot on every song how far you can push the limiter before you squeeze the dynamics too much. You want to have some dynamics intact, but on the other hand, you don't want it to be too quiet either, because compared to the other songs in a playlist or in an album, the song doesn't present itself well when it sounds quieter than the others, because our ears tend to favor loudness over dynamics, for example. So find that sweet spot. In my experience, that's between -10 and -8 RMS. RMS stands for root mean square and is the average volume. And if you think it's too quiet, you can always insert another limiter and push it a bit further. But the best thing you can do is to go back to the mix and fix it there. Put an extra limiter on each bus, on the drum bus, on the bass bus, on the instruments bus, on the vocal bus, and squeeze the dynamics there instead of squeezing them all together on the stereo bus. That's my advice. Next up, the third item on the list is to check the waveform. The waveform can give you a lot of hints on what's going on with the track. It's a visual representation of the audio. If you see some spikes at the waveform, it might be an indication that something wrong is happening. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything is wrong, even though something strange is indicated, but it's always good to check, and then you can listen back with a fresh pair of ears and see what's going on. And maybe you find that it's peaking right there where the spike is. Who knows? But you should check it out. And if you discover some errors, refer to item number 1 on the checklist. If you had any value out of this video so far, hit the like button. I would really appreciate it. Next item on the list is mono. Check your song in mono, check how it feels, how it sounds. Every DAW has a mono button somewhere. In Logic Pro, you have the gain plugin, and all other DAWs should have something that resembles this one. You just sum your track to mono and listen back. What you should hear when you hit the mono button is that instead of the signal being spread to the left and right speaker, you should hear everything coming from the dead center. Some elements might be a bit quieter, and some might be a bit louder, but if there are drastic changes in the audio, something's wrong down the line. You should check the mix and see what's going on. Maybe there are some phase cancellations, who knows? And the best thing to do then is go back to the mix and fix it there. Which leads us to item number 5 on the list, and that's phase. Check the phase, and it's easily done by using a correlation meter like this one. It should be nice and clean in the green, and you can also see on this stereo image meter that everything is nice and clean in the middle. There should be most energy in the middle, especially in a genre like this, the hip-hop genre, where you have the strong kick, a strong bass, and a strong snare, which all are pan dead center. Also a strong lead vocal, which also resides in the middle. And if you hear some weirdness going on, words disappearing, drum hits disappearing, or sounding weak, might be phase issues, but use your ears. Ultimately, those will be your final judges. And if there are issues here, again, go back to the mix. It's your best bet. And if you want to learn even more about phase issues in the mix, check out Spinlight Studios. A really great guy. I love his content. Their videos are great and he explains it really well. Next up comes item number 6, and this is an easy one. Check that there is silence in the beginning and that there are some fades at the end. The silence in the beginning is to make sure that the first initial transient of the song doesn't get faded in. That can sometimes happen when bouncing the song. And then at the end, make sure that there's a fade here, as you can see in the end, to prevent eventual pops or clicks or other unintentional sounds. Item number 7 on the list is to check the stereo imaging. Pull up a game plugin or something that resembles the game plugin and swap the LNR and check, does it still sound good? Or is the balance a bit off? If you hear that the right side is louder, for example, than the left side, it can happen when you do a lot of stereo stuff in the mix. You can always pull up an EQ like this and enhance certain frequencies a bit. Be careful though, because you might insert some issues, you never know. Best bet, again, is to go back to the mix and fix it there. And item number 8 on the list is to check references. Using references is not exclusive to the mixing stage or to the mastering stage, but you can use references before releasing your song as well. Just to check. And a pro tip is to put your song into a playlist with other songs using Spotify, for example. Make sure that the gain is adjusted for the Spotify playback volume. Maybe you have 3 or 4 songs there in addition to your own, and then you can check it out. Do you hear some differences? Anything that you react upon in the context of the other songs? So that's a pro tip right there. Atcha. And whatever you hear that sounds strange or weird, you can always go back and try to fix it either in the mix or at the mastering stage. And now comes the 9th thing that you should consider before releasing your song, and that is to test the mix in different environments. The most famous environment to check your mix in is in the car. And that's not because the car always have the best speakers, but because we often listen to music in the car. So we are quite accustomed with how music sounds in our cars. So therefore the car test has become so famous. So check it in your car if you have one, but if you never listen to music in a car and you borrow a car just to check the mix, it makes no sense. Check your song in familiar environments such as AirPods, your phone speakers, your laptop speaker, the speaker system in your living room, a Bluetooth speaker, and so on and so forth. Do several tests in different environments. And a pro tip is to turn the volume down, really down, and listen to it in different environments at low level. Also, try cranking it up and see how it matches with maybe the other references in your playlist if you've done the item number 8 properly. Another great test of your song is the famous corridor test, where you turn on your song and then you leave the room, you go to another room, and then you listen to the song through the walls. And you might discover something else when listening to that there. And now comes the 10th and final thing that you should consider before releasing your song. But before you do that, if you like this video, hit the like button. If you want more of these videos, hit the subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, what do you think is the most important thing to check before releasing a song? I would love to discuss. And here it comes. Show your song to a friend. Not just sending out songs to random friends, but have a real good friend come over, someone who likes your style of music, and sit down on a couch, turn on the music, and look at him, observe him or her as he or she listens to your music. How is the reaction? Where is the reaction taking place? And if you've made a lot of music before and enjoyed showing to other people live while being in the same room together, it's a great thing to do because you get the immediate feedback, and that feedback is physical. It's in their facial expression, it's in their body language. You get the most honest feedback that way. And now you should be ready to release your song. Just do it. Hit release, go to DistroKid, upload your song, go to SoundCloud, go to YouTube, upload your song everywhere and post it on social media, post it to your email list if you have it, and pat yourself on the shoulder because you've done a great job. And that's it. That was the final step. The song is released. It's out there. I've linked to it in the description. It's on Spotify. Everywhere you can stream music, it's available. And don't leave without the free resources that I've linked in the description. And if you're still watching, I really appreciate it. Hit the like button if you like this, and check out one of these videos. I think they will do you good. And I hope I see you in the next video.